Today's session is about digital prop tech and community engagement. Could we have the next slide, please? Just to explain, my name is Ruth McCarthy. I'm with Homes England. The Local Government Capacity Centre develops, curates and designs well-structured, accessible offers for local government with the aim of increasing capacity and skills to support the development of homes and communities. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda for today. I'm doing the introduction and welcome. We then have my colleague Chris Standish from Homes England, who'll be talking about effective engagement. I'm really pleased to welcome Bridget Wilkins and Louise Wellham, who will be talking about the Prop Tech Engagement Fund, who are from DLUHC. This session will be followed by Jack Curran and Victoria Leeson, who are also from Homes England, and they'll be talking about using 3D to visualise space. We'll then have time for a question and answer session, and we'll run some polls at the end. We'll find out whether your knowledge of the subject has increased and any final thoughts and any comments you wish to add about future sessions. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about prop tech? In this session, we will include a DLUHC intro to piloting digital citizen engagement tools. We'll include Homes England's activities to date, potential learning for councils and other public sector organisations. And by the end of the session, you'll know Homes England motivation for community engagement, DLUHC's approach to digital engagement, and you'll have a lot more knowledge about the topic. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Chris Standish to start with, and he will be talking about effective engagement to impact places. Thanks very much, Chris.
Lovely, and thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. If we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The placemaking process is about having communities at the centre. That's from Elena Madison. I don't know if you know her. She's Director of Projects at Project for Public Spaces. I wonder what you think about that. The placemaking process is about having communities at the centre. And really, this is just to provide a bit of context for the more detailed slides and presentations that will follow. At Homes England, we want to reconnect and empower communities with our investments. We don't want to assume that we know what's best for a place. We really do want to get our fingernails dirty and understand what's going on and what's really important to a place. We want to involve as many people as possible. We want to hear different views from different people that's going to impact their lives in a positive way. And we want to be able to influence, share and collaborate. It's not about a top-down approach. It's about a collective approach to making places better through this wonderful creative vehicle called community engagement. Next one, please. Final slide for me, really, and hopefully you're going to have loads of stuff in the chat about stuff like this, which is connecting community engagement with locally relevant social value. How can we achieve that? We at Homes England have got a way, and we're starting to roll that out. Trying to use community engagement as a pathway to think about outcomes. What are we trying to achieve through our investments in roads and infrastructure and housing and regeneration? What are the outcomes that we want? What's the places we want to leave? What's the legacy that we want to leave behind? And locally important regeneration opportunities, not just physical ones, but transformation of education, health, job skills and training. How can we get into some of the places that have been stuck for generations and use our privileged position to try and change some of that? And we absolutely want to work digitally and in more traditional ways of communicating with and engaging with communities. It's a hybrid approach that we advocate to build local partnerships. So we have a strategy, Homes England Community Engagement Strategy. We have a toolkit. We've got various work streams. We're currently working in a very focused way on 15 or 16 key projects across the country, and we've got a growing team. So if you want to know any more about any of that stuff, please do get in touch or put something in the chat. That's it from me. Hand you on to the next one. And I think it's brilliant, Bridget.
Oh, thank you, Chris. It's a good introduction. I'll take that. Well, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you to Chris, Ruth, and the wider team at Homes England. It's great to join you here today. My name is Bridget Wilkins, Head of Digital Citizen Engagement in the Digital Planning team. And I'll also pass to my brilliant colleague, Lou, to introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Bridget. Hi, I'm Lou, working in the same team as Bridget on all things digital citizen engagement. I'll be covering the second half of the presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lou. And it's brilliant to see such a great range of people in the crowd, some new names and some familiar ones as well. And for us, I think a really exciting moment to share some of the work we're doing in the wonderful world of digital citizen engagement against the backdrop of planning and digital planning reform, and some of the insights we're seeing through our work in the PropTech Fund. So can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Very on brand, we wanted to start our session with a poll as well and quickly ask the audience, for those joining us today, have you ever responded to a planning consultation? So we'll let that pop up for a moment and welcome your questions and responses there. We love to start with this one because arguably most of us here should be saying yes, but it's always interesting to see, to sense check that one. So I think as we're seeing these live responses come in, it's not a bad split. 60% yes, 37, 38% no. I'll just click yes as well. There we go. I think that's on par with what people are saying when we asked us at DLUHC as well. Okay, that's a good start. That's a good start, 60%. But there's about 40% there that haven't responded, and I think that probably speaks to some of the points in our presentation today. I think there's one more poll to come up. I'll let the team. There we go. The multi-million-pound question, if you have responded, was it to object or support? I'll let that poll pop up. This is the one we're really interested in. Again, the numbers don't lie. So about 70% it's looking like to object and 35-40 to support. And we've got a both. Thanks, Natalie. I think it's interesting, isn't it, based on what we're actually consulting on and how it's done and you know the different tools that are being used. So perhaps that's part of the next session that we'd love to share with you. We've got a couple of comments there. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for responding to those polls. If we can go to the next slide, please. I think those responses are very in line with some of the feedback we've had when we asked this question at DLUHC and recently at our National Planning Conference as well. And I think speak to the desire to respond, but sometimes the confusion on some of those binary points. Are we supporting? Are we objecting? Are we somewhere in the middle? And how do we break that down? And I think that speaks to the wider context of change that's happening around us, you know, particularly in the built environment, at an unprecedented pace and level, whether it's around planning reform, whether it's about local plans, neighbourhood planning, or perhaps just seeing change manifest around us in the communities that we work, live and play, and speak to a broader opportunity for us all to be involved in that conversation around change and the opportunity to co-design what change looks like for the places that we care about and that we're involved in. Next slide, please. Thank you, Ruth. I think it's fair to say that the conversation around change has often been quite adversarial, and these are just a few examples that I'm sure many in the audience relate to, given your variety of roles in the sector, where unfortunately the conversations around change are often limited by only hearing from those who oppose and object, rather than perhaps the 60% we've got in the conversation today and others who actually support the change and support some of the outcomes that this change manifests. What's really interesting from our perspective at the Department for Levelling Up is that, you know, this is not a UK issue, the conversation around change in the built environment, but the UK, you know, has an opportunity to be a world leader in this space, given the brilliant industry we have who wants to push the outcomes forward, given the amazing level of community response we're seeing in consultations and engagement, not just in planning, but in other areas as well. And our other unique ingredient, which is the fast-growing and fast-paced prop tech sector, and how we can leverage that to enable different conversations around change and different approaches to community engagement and consultations. Next slide, please. Because we know that people do want to engage, and these stats, I think, speak to the polls a few minutes ago, and I think a general sentiment and recognition from us as an industry that people do want to be part of that conversation. They want to have the opportunity to co-design the outcomes that impact them at a really tangible, physical and personal level, and also to be part of that wider strategic decision making, whether that's different demographics, tapping into different audiences, or perhaps just for the first time feeling like they can contribute to the world around them. And so it's a question of how we leverage that sentiment and bring people into that decision-making process. Next slide, please. Ultimately, that's where we'd love to come in and use part of our digital planning reform and our program to make planning easier to engage. And I'm sure many of us have seen or experienced this physical lamppost experience. You see something slapped on, you see people right up against it. It's hard to read. It's often only in English. It's one-dimensional. It's flat. And certainly it doesn't bring to life some of the visions and the outcomes that we're all trying to achieve through planning and wider regeneration. And so there is a really interesting question of when we take that and we translate those analog and static digital lampposts to a digital interface and screen, what could that experience be? How does that change the user experience and perhaps even the consultation results as well, to have a much more dynamic and engaging experience in consultations and tapping into that wider community sentiment and support for demand. Next slide, please. That's where we come in. And our vision for digital citizen engagement against the backdrop of planning reform is to support the sector, both local government and wider industry, to evolve their approaches to consultations and engagement and to leverage the prop tech sector and the best of the digital tools available to us to ultimately fast track and streamline the planning process, but also ultimately the delivery of housing and infrastructure as well. Now, whilst we're sitting here under a digital planning banner, we are by no means saying digital should completely replace the in-person, almost invaluable human experience of one-to-one engagement. In fact, that provides such a rich opportunity to have that feedback with communities. What we're saying is digital should enable that face-to-face person engagement to be more inclusive and to be dynamic and to reach the audiences who would never come to those in-person traditional events. And we're seeing some really interesting case studies emerge when we're blending almost a hybrid approach, as Chris mentioned, of both traditional and digital techniques and tactics. Next slide, please. So what does success look like for us at DLUHC looking at this program? There's really three key pillars we want to share with the audience today. One is around how we work with industry to evolve the expectations on the role of consultations, shifting from those lampposts to digital methods and something in between, recognizing that it's different for every context, every community, every planning team, based on both level of resource and budget, and also where you're at in your planning and housing delivery and what your community wants to engage and how they engage. But how can we work with industry to challenge what that approach is and evolve it as well with emerging best practice? How we work with industry to scale more cost-effective and more efficient software solutions that are ultimately easy to use for everyone, whether it's communities responding, planners setting it up, or brilliant comms teams in between, that make it more efficient and reduce the time it takes to undertake consultations, both from users using it and actually setting it up and looking at the data it's generating behind the scenes. And ultimately ensuring that local authorities, as part of a wider ecosystem, have genuine choice in the marketplace, that they can go to market and find the best solution that works for them based on their capacity and their resources. And by having enough choice, it's driving more consistent and qualified demand back into the prop tech sector to drive that ongoing product innovation. So the role of DLUHC here is to sit in between both supply and demand and support that ecosystem to grow and to innovate and to adapt over the medium to long term. Next slide, please. We're doing this and we're testing some of these approaches and these emerging outcomes through the work of the PropTech Engagement Fund, which was launched just over 18 months ago, and I think it's fair to say has completely blown us away with the level of demand from both local authorities, from the real estate and sort of private developer industry, from the PropTech sector. And it's been great to work with Chris and the team at Homes England over the last 12 months to really, again, inform and refine our assumptions of who we're working with and what we're seeing through this essentially delivery vehicle to test what the future could look like in this space. Next slide, please. what's really exciting is we've been able to fund 45 different local authorities in the country that are as north as Wirral, as south as Cornwall. We've got really interesting community demographics. We're consulting on, the future of high streets and public realm nighttime strategies, local plans, statutory plans, infrastructure, allocating community seal in section 106 for the first time, estate regeneration. We're trying to use this fund to enable local authorities to consult on as broad and diverse range of projects as we can possibly touch, to see what is that golden thread of what works here, and also what doesn't work, and how do we acknowledge that and be honest about that, and really look at the role that technology can play to enable a more accessible and inclusive conversation around the built environment, and working with some brilliant local authorities to test some of that alongside the prop tech sector and also the industry as well. So with that, I'm going to go to Lou to share some of the emerging outcomes of the fund.
Thank you. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks, Bridget. And what better way to explain all of that, even beyond the slides, and to show you some images and some examples of what we've been doing. And I think there's some more images on the next slide. So I think it's clear here that our local authorities and their kind of tech partners have been trying to make these digital experiences as interactive and engaging as possible. And you can see from the examples here from Built ID and Commonplace that really helps kind of reduce barriers to engagement, both by making things more visually interesting, but also by not asking too much of those who we're trying to engage. So, breaking down those barriers of asking for loads of personal information, for example. You can see in the survey top left, we're just asking people to use imagery to think about what means the most to them in their local area, because we know that people don't have a lot of time on their hands. So how can we create really visually engaging platforms that also just make it as easy as possible for whoever you are to get involved? And on top of this, there's incentives that can be used. You'll see on the right that one of our local authorities, use kind of gift vouchers to incentivize people to get engaged. So we shouldn't shy away from that. There are a lot of seldom heard groups out there who need that kind of incentive to get involved. So it's interesting to see how that can be used to their advantage as well. And I'm sure Homes England will talk about the kind of flyover image that we've got at the bottom here. Amazing to look at the way 3D models are going moving forward. And that's a big future focus for us as well. Next slide, please. So what Bridget said earlier about, the importance of in-person continuing as well as digital is absolutely true. So you can see from these images here, which give probably the best insight into what these local authorities have been doing, that the local authority teams have put huge effort into making engagement properly hybrid and making sure that those who really want to get to grips with these tools and issues, or to talk to someone in person, can. And we as a team have been lucky enough to get down. If you can kind of, where's Wally? You'll probably see us in there somewhere. We've been lucky enough to go and see them ourselves as well. So what we've heard from a lot of the local authorities is that the key has been with these events to go to where people are, and to take the effort to find out where communities like to be, to hang out, rather than expecting someone to come to your local library at very unusual hours. And it takes time and effort to do that, and sometimes a little bit of money as well. But what we've heard back is that it's so worth it to have that combined approach, the kind of two-pronged way of engaging people. And that's going to continue moving forward, we think. Next slide, please. So Bridget touched on earlier kind of what success means for us. And I think we started out with 4 key metrics really that we really wanted to focus on, especially with round 2 of our fund. And it's really crucial for us to be able to measure the success of all this work. And the first of these was that we really wanted to ensure that we were bringing new voices into planning conversations. And we've been really delighted to see the proof of what local authorities have been able to achieve in that space. So, I mean, some of the stats on this slide are just incredible. The quantity of people, but also the diversity has really impressed us. Some authorities seeing up to like 350% increases in the amount of respondents they're getting, particularly on that bottom left one, under the age of 34. I saw someone asking the chat about how much young people are engaging here, and it's not been easy across the board to get that youth engagement, but we have seen some examples, particularly where using social media, where that's helped. So it's great to see that coming through. And yeah, important reminder that quantity is not everything, and that we need to make sure we're getting a broad range that is representative, which is the ultimate goal of this work really. But we've got loads more we can share, and we'll be publishing some case studies soon to see some of these real stats coming through. Next slide, please. The second thing that we really wanted to focus on and to prove was that, we could increase the positivity of the dialogue around planning and potentially, the support for planning by engaging that extra kind of diversity and breadth of voices. And in many cases, we've heard that anecdotally from LPAs that has worked. To be completely transparent, it's hard to measure that stuff, particularly when you're working on things like local plans where a yes isn't necessarily the answer. It's more about raising awareness and getting people involved. So that's a real focus for us moving forward, thinking about how we measure that kind of thing. But you'll see on screen here, people are, local authorities are finding ways to kind of test, particularly when it's not local plan focused, like on a development, for example, how people have kind of come round to the idea or been able to understand the value of development more through these tools. And particularly top left, I wanted to highlight, we've got Victoria on the call here in Cornwall. They were able to really increase kind of the positivity of planning conversation here, which I think I'll, come on to in next slides. But yeah, there are examples where this is starting to happen, which is really positive. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. As our kind of third pillar of what we wanted to focus on and try and create successes for, we wanted to focus on increasing, the efficiencies that local authorities experience through these digital tools. And for us, that meant kind of increasing capacity and capability, freeing up time and reducing costs where possible. And that continues to be a huge focus for us moving forward. You can see here that some local authorities were able to achieve up to kind of 40% reduction in the time they were spending processing consultation responses. And in recent months, we've been really exploring that in detail with some of our industry stakeholders, like the Planning Inspectorate, for example, to try and solve those inefficiencies end to end, because we know that local authorities are part of the process, but not the whole process. So thinking about how efficiencies can be created across the whole process itself and taking a more holistic approach to capability and capacity, even small things like reducing the need to have names and addresses like we talked about earlier, can save a huge amount of time. So working with stakeholders to think about small wins in that space that we can help drive. Next slide, please. So the final, I think, I don't know if we slipped past one, but I'll just talk about a kind of final outcome, which is really close to our hearts, and that's the kind of legacy of these tools, and being able to show that moving forward, even if it's in a really small way, local authorities can take forward learnings from digital innovation and for that to make a difference for residents as well. We've been really pleased to see that after the fund, whether it's big or small, a lot of local authorities have been finding ways to integrate digital assisted engagement into their approaches moving forward, even if it's just using a few £100s on social media or going as broad as creating their own digital platforms in-house. So that legacy for us has been really great to see, and it's the key to us continuing that breadth and positivity and openness of planning conversations in the long term. So, where to next? I think we wanted to round off on this because there's so much going on, and we try our best to be open with that, and we want to continue our conversations moving forward. So you've seen, that how dedicated we are, both in central and local government and at Homes England, to pushing this stuff forward. I think I mentioned we'll be publishing our round 1 case studies in the next couple of weeks on our kind of local digital blog, which we're really excited to share. We'll also be wrapping up round 2 of our PropTech Engagement Fund. So 2 kind of big wrap-up pieces there, which will finally get case studies out into the world. We're kind of in the middle of kicking off our continuous funding round, which has some amazing local authorities within it, looking at kind of producing more efficiencies, which I mentioned earlier, and kind of standardizing various data sets across the industry. So we'll absolutely be sharing more about that on our blog. And we want to get more transparent with our roadmap as well. So thinking about where DLUHC and our DCE team as a whole are moving forward, and how we're working with our policy teams to make sure that everything we're learning in these pilots is being integrated back into, regulation, legislation in the right way. So yeah, we'll be being more transparent on that moving forward, and hope to use our local digital website as a forum for that. And more generally, everyone on this call has already shown that they're interested. That's why you're here. So we'd love to continue kind of advocating with you and working with you, to drive this movement forward, and to, whether it's big or small, find ways to integrate kind of digital innovation and engagement innovation into ways of working. I think on the next slide, there's just one more mention of how you can get in touch with us. We have our kind of Twitter handle, LinkedIn handle, but also our local digital website is the best way to kind of see everything that's going on. So I think we're right on time here, and I can see lots of questions, which I'm sure we'll come to later. So I'll hand back to Ruth or Victoria.
Thanks,
Yeah, actually, we're
thanks, Louisa,
handing over to Victoria now and Jack.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
hi everyone. So I'm Jack Curran, Senior Manager within the Geospatial team here at Homes England, and I'm joined by our wonderful Victoria Leeson, Senior Partnership Manager in our Markets, Partners and Places Directorate. And it's our pleasure to be delving into one particular and very prominent area of PropTech and digital engagement, and that is 3D digital mapping. But before we go any further, we'd like to present a poll of our own, just so we can gauge everyone's familiarity with the subject. So, how familiar are you with the concept of 3D digital mapping? So the poll should be up on your screen now, so please take a moment to respond. Don't worry, there's no right or wrong answer. We're just trying to gauge the audience's experience on this. So we'll just give it a few moments. Hopefully everyone should see that poll now. So I'll just give it a few more moments. Okay, results coming in. That's good. Okay, this is good. It's most are saying, you know, we've got 54% saying we've got the basic gist. So that's good. Some of the principles we discussed in this session should be familiar to you, but you may find some of our experiences and case studies of interest. So that's good. It's good to see. So we'll move on now to the next slide. So we'll start with why 3D in particular. Well, as touched on in some of the feedback Bridget and Louise encountered, the use of 3D technology can be instrumental in communicating schemes, and there have been large strides in this technology in recent years. This was further encouraged via the Planning for the Future white paper and DLUHC's very own PropTech engagement fund, as we've just been hearing about, which is all focusing on the digitalization of planning. And out of this, there's been a big push toward making maps and proposals easier to access and understand, specifically through the use of 3D visualizations. As the government's delivery arm, Homes England want to be utilising this technology where we can, which all ties into the agency's one of the agency's core strategic aims of delivering housing. Use of this technology also leaves us sharing a common goal with Bridget's team and essentially focusing on that aim to democratise planning. So next slide, please. So that's one of the reasons we're using this technology, but you may be thinking to yourselves, well, that's fine, but why should we be using it? Well, when it comes to planning and consultation, the use of 3D reduces cognitive effort. Like technical drawings and statistics can all be displayed on screen at once in an easy to digest format. And this in turn promotes neurodiversity regarding consultations. It enables collaborative review by sharing the visuals across various mediums such as web-based interactive maps, and it helps build transparency and trust between relevant parties such as members of the community, planning officers, architects, etc. And it has the potential to reduce costs over time by speeding up decision making. So at this point, to switch to the next slide, I will hand over to Victoria.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Victoria Leeson, and I'm Senior Partnership Manager at Homes England. And I partner with LAs across the Southwest and the Midlands. And in partnership, I look at what are the interventions that are needed to help deliver places. And they're normally places that are really difficult to deliver in terms of multi-land ownership, complexities of infrastructure, complexities with town city centre locations, what's the density, what's the place, what matters to local people. So why now? And I noticed on the comments that somebody said we've been using this 3D technology for donkey's years. The industry use it, architects use it all the time. I was using it 10, 20 years ago. But we don't use it in planning, and we now have the facility through cloud storage to save a lot of data and to be able to visualize that through tools like Teams So a lot's changed since COVID. And then places matter. Places are changing. We're all going over to carbon zero. We're all going to be looking underground at our electricity capacity. We're all looking at our connectivity. How do active travel plans affect housing plans, affect community facilities? And all of those things matter, and they all sort of are coming together. They have been for donkey's years, but we've got tools now that we can use at speed, collaboratively on Teams, on Zoom. So this is why now. Next slide, please. And that new technology through QR codes, through people's mobile phones, headsets like VR sets was something, 3 years ago we were looking at going to make the difference. But actually, we're not even using the headsets anymore. We're doing it on Teams. We're collaborating around 3D models instead of 2D models. Next slide, please. And what we're finding through these 3D models is that the community engagement is that much more. It's just fun. It's really interesting that what we found from the results are that when somebody sees this in 3D, everybody sees the same thing. Whereas the interpretation of 2D maps, quite often you'll get two completely different thoughts around, well, what did that entrance look like? Oh, but where was such and such? Whereas when people share 3D, suddenly there's a common understanding of the place that's being presented to them at the consultation events. On this image, you can see myself on a bike. And we did a consultation where we took councillors, we took the local people on a journey from one site to another site. And then all of a sudden, everybody understood the connection. All of a sudden, everybody was on the same page. Whereas my thoughts before that were that we had to explain it in multiple different ways, and we still weren't getting everybody on the same page. So that sort of speeded up that process of understanding place. Next slide, please. And what we've been doing is we've been working with organisations like Network Rail, like the Design Council, and we've been looking at how do we connect with an audience? How do we find out how their movements affect what they see and what their experience is, and how do they feel when they arrive at destinations? And we've been collecting that data digitally. We've been able to process it quicker, and we've been able to see some common themes. And what we've found also with the engagement is a real experience that they want to come back and consult again. They want to see the next iteration of the design. They want to engage again. And we're getting a much more diverse audience, young and old, and it's right across the piece, which I think is really important. Next slide, please. And then what we've also found through Homes England is that we've found that we can share that experience with experts, even experts from abroad who are specialists in children's play or manual streets or active travel. And we can share that with experts on design panels. And it really opens up everybody to a real collaboration on Teams, seeing things in 3D, being able to move around a model to see it at different heights, not just helicopter sites, but at sort of eye level, children's level, adults level. You can start to see things that perhaps you couldn't before. Next slide, please. And I'll hand back to Jack.
Thanks, Victoria. So that's a bit of the background theory, but now we'd like to share some practical ways in which we've been using this technology. As mentioned, I work in the geospatial team here at Homes England, and we've been exploring ways we can unlock the 3D capability we have available to us. This involves combining various data sources to create engaging 3D maps, which we've been sharing in a variety of ways, some of which I'll demonstrate shortly. Next slide, please. So what data are we talking about? Well, I'll avoid going into too much technical detail, but 3D maps can be created by utilizing various forms of data, such as satellite imagery, LiDAR point clouds, and photogrammetric 3D models. We've included a short blurb on what LiDAR is for those who are unfamiliar, but I recommend looking up these terms, particularly regarding DEFRA's wealth of open source, that's free, point cloud data that covers most of the country. It's worth mentioning that as a public sector organisation, we make good use of the data we have access to under the public sector geospatial agreement, including aerial photography, OS building heights, and digital elevation models representing terrain and surface details. Next slide, please. So we've been using this technology on a number of our projects to various ends. For example, we can effectively market our sites or provide more rounded data for land we're trying to sell by providing this in a 3D format. As mentioned, it helps increase the transparency between architects and ourselves, which results in aiding or influencing the design process. And we have found it helps our project teams understand our sites more cohesively. But most importantly, it provides a high degree of clarity for community engagement. We are expecting that in the near future, we'll be seeing a lot more from this approach, to the point where it will likely be considered the norm. Therefore, we want to ensure we're at the forefront, really grasping the capabilities and benefits so we can help inform the direction of travel in this area. Additionally, we've also been working with a few local authorities in unlocking their own 3D capabilities. Although I should say not to the same scale as Bridget's team. But in a select few scenarios, we provided assistance with procurement of services or helped them become familiar with capability that they weren't aware they already possessed. Next slide, please. I'd now like to run through a number of examples to provide context, and this site in Bristol was an interesting one which lends itself well to 3D mapping. There's a power line running through it and sits on sloping terrain. We were taking an outline planning application to public consultation, so we're looking for material we could use to best communicate the plans. Therefore, we created a basic 3D scene using an early layout created by the consultant to show the plans in situ. The beauty of this platform is that you can host it online and it can be embedded on the website and viewed on mobile devices and tablets. However, the project team had some reservations over the ability of free navigation. So as a learning exercise, we trialed an alternative format. So next slide, please. We ultimately produced 360 panoramas you can see on the engagement website here. This still provided an element of interactivity, but restricted the user to a fixed view. These views were displayed on a laptop during the consultation event, and it was felt that the visuals were enormously helpful in presenting the master plan to the public. The public appreciated the effort the 3D model demonstrated, as it showed an element of commitment to doing things properly and transparently. For example, there were no complaints we hadn't engaged properly on this site. Another interesting aspect of this work was assisting with the design process. We provided the consultant with comprehensive contextual data for the site, and we were able to highlight challenging areas that required more thought, such as proposed buildings imposing too much on existing flats in the northwest corner, all based on proposed and existing ground levels. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next example, at De Havilland Park. The project team wanted a 3D map produced in collaboration with the appointed master planners on the site. We collated the existing data we have available under the public sector geospatial agreement to create the site context. We then combined this with the master planners' plans to produce what you see here in a very short amount of time, which was ultimately hosted on the project's website. The fly-through enabled audiences to use the development, to see the development from their own perspective, and could be paused on areas that individuals wanted to discuss in more detail. And a number of visitors would hang around the display and watch the video several times through. Displaying the plans in a contextual 3D scene such as this helped highlight mitigation on contentious areas and emphasize the green space, such as views down the valley. And additionally, and similarly to Brislington, showing it in this format helped reinforce the fact that we care about the proposals and their impact. So next slide, please. Over 200 members of the community attended the two-day event, and in addition, the communications consultant used on the project recorded over 700 views of the video, which have been promoted to a 1 mile radius of the site for a cost of only £20. The age profile of viewers was also balanced, and particularly so for men in the younger 25 to 44 age brackets. The model then went on to be used in the design and access statement, design code, LVIA, which all made the exercise pretty cost efficient. Next slide, please. By using a similar combination of techniques to the previous examples, we've been able to map the entirety of a proposed new town of Norstow in 3D on our geospatial platform. This has allowed us to communicate this scheme more effectively, both internally and externally. One example was showing the outline planning proposals for phase 3 of the scheme alongside the 3D point cloud from DEFRA. This effectively showed how the scheme will be masked by existing vegetation, which is represented by the point cloud, and how much of that said vegetation will be retained. We've gone on to produce other videos, such as an explainer video for the town centre proposals, which was used for internal review and development management sessions. It was used at a marketing event showing partners what was coming up, and it was used at a Norstow community forum, which was very well received. And by having the model updated with all the latest proposals, we could easily communicate the scheme and how it will look once completed in 2040. So we created a video that was used at community engagement event in July last year, and the team involved felt that it gave the audience really something really exciting to look at and helped mitigate some recent negativity that had been faced at the time. Our next aim for Norstow is to make our cloud-based interactive 3D map publicly accessible via the Norstow website. This will allow users to explore the proposals freely and help improve engagement and transparency. So next slide, please. One of our more recent engagement examples is that of the Southwest Rugby Homestead link. It was felt that a 3D visualization would help emphasize the amount of green space being proposed and retained to greater communicate how much the impacts of the bypass will be mitigated from the existing settlements. In the fly-through, we made sure to cover how much of the area, we made sure to cover as much of the area as possible in order to make the proposal transparent to the audience. And we generated the data in our geospatial environment and then exported it out to this more polished format you can see here. When shown at the engagement event, the visualization was very popular, attracting a lot of people to watch it. And it also helped engage the younger generation, which was really great to see. One issue we did encounter, however, was that we deliberately left out the corresponding housing proposals in order to prevent any confusion over what the actual application was for. This led to some comments that the visualization was perhaps being slightly disingenuous. So we ultimately created a revised version which included illustrative layouts so that we could show before and afters. That being said, points such as this really demonstrated how the visualization drew out people's understanding and discussion points in a way that 2D plans simply don't. It was felt that people really understood the 3D format more so than plans. And since the engagement event, the visuals have been further used for social media posts and most recently used by valuers to gauge the impact of the proposals on existing homes. Next slide, please. So one final example for me is that of our West of Ifield site. So by using similar techniques, once again, we were able to build up a 3D map ahead of a recent consultation event. This video was used to bring the 2D master plan to life, and the ability to embed this scheme within the existing landscape enabled the team involved to highlight the landscape-led approach and demonstrate limited visual impacts on existing areas or how ancient woodland is being maintained. Similarly to the Homestead link, it provided an alternative discussion point during the in-person events, making it easier to manage attendees. And making the flyover available online also provided a useful tool to engage website visitors and was used by online media outlets as a different and more engaging tool, which increased the reach of the project through local media outlets. As such, it was also utilised on the local BBC News broadcast at the time. So I'll switch over to Victoria to cover the next slide, please.
So I'm just going to run through a case that we're currently working on in Cornwall, where we looked at place as a whole, and we did this in 2 chunks. So we did employ a consultant to scan the town, and you end up with drawings like this, a 3D model, and then we added on to that texture such as the brick. We added on snow in this particular case, but you can add sunshine, which does make a difference to consultations. And what you can do with this model is you can go around at eye level. We also put some constraints reports on top of the model so that we could show people where all the utilities were, so that we could be really honest with the public and say, look, we're very unlikely to be digging up all of these utilities. Therefore, that's a constraint on the site. So, it sort of engages them in what's possible and what's not. And what we did was we ran through how would you get from one site to another site. And this is just showing you how we engaged in terms of giving people an e-bike and setting them off on a path through their own town. And what it came back with was, oh, no, well, now we get why you want to link these two places together. And now we get why we would make those improvements in that particular place. But what they came back with was, oh, we really like this. This is really good. Actually, we want to do the high street. Can we do the high street? So we then set out to say, okay, so here's the high street. And what they needed to know was the real good quality of how it looked, how it would look if they pedestrianised it, how would it look with trees. So we were able to show them how certain things could look or not, so that they could start to discuss what would work and what wouldn't work. And lots of ideas came from that. So we went out at that very early stages of vision, that very early stage before we'd even done any master planning. But what we did look at was the constraints of the site, so that we could share that knowledge with the public, so that so that they could anticipate what's coming up. One of the big problems, as we all know, is parking, and there were ideas around parking that we shared with them. Other things that came up about views and how you would look at things. So we said, okay, well, let's have a look at those views. So we'll go back right to the coastal path. We'll stand at the coastal path and we'll look back. So what does it look like from there? And then people were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we'll get that now. So it was really bringing people on board right at those very early stages, and the engagement was excellent. And like I say, we got a really good diverse audience. We looked at the population of the town, and then we looked at the population that were engaging, and it was pretty much matched. Previously, without this sort of 3D engagement, it was your typical older person that would turn up at the town hall and look at plans, whereas we got a lot of younger audience in, and the kids were helping people use the PlayStation moving tools, and we're helping people to actually sort of work around it. The other thing that we found from the public consultation was, this is great, so this is our current town, this is what we like, this is what we don't like, what you're doing next, we want to come back, this is great, we want to come back. So we had really, really positive feedback. Next slide, please. As we journeyed around the model, we were asking questions, so that we collected this digital answers digitally, so that we could then group them, and then we could analyze that with a consultant. But this is not expensive to do, and we would say that if you're doing a large development, we would say that the people who are doing that, should be made to do this, because it's not that expensive to do. To just scan it, I noticed there was a question in the talk. To scan a whole high street like you've just seen is around about 20 to 30,000 pounds. But once you've got that scan, you've got that scan forever. So then, if there's multiple planning applications, the planners, the person putting in the planning application would pay to drop in their model that their architect would have done. So it's quite economic to do. Next slide, please. And then what we've also done now with the layering of the constraints of the data is we've layered that with utilities, and we're now asking and sharing that with the planning, the transport department within the same LA, to say, well, where are your EV chargers going to be, that will extend beyond this place, and how does that affect this place? So now that we're collaborating with different layers, so we've got the utility companies, we've got the transport, we've got active travel, we've got multiple teams now all looking at the same model on Teams, and it's becoming much clearer in terms of collaborating and bringing forward a plan together on the same timeline. The other thing that this really does is it shows you shadows, it shows you where the daylight is going to be. This particular place, we're interested in where cafes were going to be in the sunlight, where parks could be, where there would be shade and sunlight, and also where taller buildings would be, and how the shade and the wind and the ice and how that would all affect place, which is something that you can put into the model. Next slide, please. And I'll hand over to Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. So as we draw our section to a close, it's worth noting some of the valuable lessons we've learned along the way. Most importantly, 3D mapping takes time. It becomes very difficult to develop a 3D map for consultation if designs are still changing mere weeks or even days before the event. Therefore, it's important this is factored into timescales from an early stage, so you can so everyone in the team can be ready. Another thing we've learned is context is king. Even with the existing context covered in 3D and the use of an inset map to show where the camera is in the current view, some audiences can struggle to orientate themselves. The use of annotations and labeling should also be considered in the 3D fly-throughs. Without the proper disclaimers, if I can get my words out properly, visualizations can risk coming across as disingenuous, as I mentioned earlier. For example, in other areas, it can be very difficult or expensive to accurately represent tree species. Showing too much house type detail at an outline planning stage risks coming across as a fait accompli. Showing not enough raises a lot of questions. Therefore, disclaimers should be used wherever possible to signify that vegetation, massing, layouts, etc. Are all illustrative. Also, whilst we're heralding the use of digital tech as a much needed move forward, we have to be conscious that there are a large number of the community that don't have easy access to these tools, and therefore we risk alienating them. I think I saw some comments in the chat on this point. Because of this, I don't think we'll be seeing the end to the hybrid approach of community engagement anytime soon, and that was further reinforced by the messages that both Louise and Bridget gave out earlier. So the next steps. Sorry, next slide, please. Where are we going from here? Well, we've provided a number of case studies today and how they've been received, but we want to put greater emphasis on the results of the consultations that are using this digital-led approach. We'll be working with Chris and our community engagement team to ensure we assess qualitative and quantitative feedback from these events and inform our future strategy in this area. It's important to factor in 3D mapping right from the outset of the project, not just for the timescales, time pressures that I mentioned earlier, but also it will help to assist in the design process. And we want to be making better use of this technology throughout the life cycle of a project. From, for example, from when we're even looking at an area of land to acquire, and then purchasing, getting 3D map created of that map, so we got that land, so we got a better understanding of it, and then overlaying models on the top of it, supplying that data out to consultants and developers, and then that can all be used to market the site at the end of the day. And of course, it goes without saying that we want to continue our collaboration with Bridget's team at DLUHC and indeed local authorities, so that we can share learning and experience to better drive the use of this technology. So that's pretty much it from me. I think at this point I'll hand back to Ruth.
Thank you, Jack. Next slide, please. So now we have a poll. And we're going to have a look at what obstacles would you face in order to actually use PropTech yourself. So please do type in here. It's a word cloud type, so type whatever you think, and we'll see some answers popping up soon. Do add in whatever things you think could be a problem for you using PropTech yourself. Oh, lots of things coming in. cost, accessibility, finance. Seems to be a lot around kind of money theme there. Cost, further understanding, more cost, a little bit about skills, a little bit about internal processes. And we may pick up a little bit more about costs in the Q&As. So thank you very much. And next slide, please. What opportunities will embracing PropTech actually offer you? Do type in your comments. So we've got range of engagement, better engagement, wider range. Please add your comments. Oh, lots more comments coming back now. That's good. Yeah, a lot about availability, range, better understanding, better conversations, more communication. Excellent. Thank you for all of these. Engagement and feedback, wider engagement, positive engagement. Excellent. Next slide, please. So some concluding points here. Government and Homes England really care about improving community engagement and PropTech. The question used to be, why 3D? But with improvements in technology, the question is now, why not 3D? If we want to streamline planning policy and development processes, then traditional methods alone can't get us there. Traditional methods led to fragmented consultation. They were really time consuming, and they tended to attract a vocal adversarial minority. Digital citizen engagement and PropTech tools can improve the outcomes, increasing the quantity and the quality in terms of diversity plus representation of people who engage, which enables a more positive conversation about planning and development, as well as saving office resource and money. Next slide, please. So we've now got a question and answer session, which I'll facilitate. And all of our speakers, Chris, Bridget, Louise, Jack and Victoria, will be joining us in a little virtual panel here. Thanks. So I'll just run through some of the questions we've had. We've had a lot of interest in this. So apologies if we don't get to every question, but there are lots here. So to start with, how do you integrate digital engagement tools while allowing for those who cannot or will not access digital platforms? If I can pose that one to Bridget, please.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ruth. And yes, it's great to see all the questions in the chat. We're just looking at sharing some more, I think, specific responses for some of them, but hopefully we can pick up some in that conversation. I think there's a broader point to answer your question. I will get there, Ruth, I promise, is around, we haven't got all the answers yet to all of this stuff of how it works practically, because it will be different for every planning team in every community context, depending on whether it's a statutory requirement or to some of the other questions, doing it as part of wider consultation and engagement. So, that specific example is exactly what we're trying to test here of what good looks like in terms of that dependency between digital and physical. So assuming that, and just speaking for some of the examples in round 2 specifically in the last 12 months, there's a really interesting piece here where you're using a digital platform to create awareness and to drive people, perhaps different type of people, to those physical events when you are still hosting them in a town hall, in a library centre or another community facility. So when you're doing that, how does that change who's in the room? And maybe to the question, take the sting out of some of those other traditional conversations. And we've seen that through, I'll share one example for round 2 where a local authority did, I think, was it, Louise, like 40 events over an 8-week period? Again, like completely different scale of project, but because they had that more holistic view of looking at that relationship between using digital to drive different people to events, and then using those events to capture different types of feedback, naturally they could have a different and less, I think, adversarial conversation. And then for another example, a local authority was funded to use a virtual reality model, and I know Jack's mentioned this as well, where by visualizing a low traffic neighborhood regeneration project, you can have a completely different conversation, because you're not looking at a PD document and trying to show someone, where's that red line boundary. You can sell that dream, you can visualize the outcomes, and you can make it personal. So we're really keen to keep exploring what that relationship looks like, both from a timing and dependency point of view, but also in the tools and tactics people can use either in person or online to change the conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Bridget. We do have a supplementary question actually to do with how you engage if you know the session's going to be quite negative and aggressive, and it's a physical session that you're dealing with.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ruth. And again, we are testing whether you can change that from the outset, because you're having a different approach to how you're driving people to that event. So, I can't speak to what, and I use the word tactics quite crudely, what tactics we all use when, we are in those situations and you might have that negative experience. We've certainly seen it both, Lou as planner and myself in previous roles, but also from hearing from different authorities. And so, everyone's got different tactics to deal with that in different situations or contexts. But we hope, and we're seeing, that using digital to get different people to those events, or to change the conversation when you're in those physical events by using virtual models, or perhaps using more strategies of youth engagement, can again just take the sting out of some of that and have a different type of conversation. One of the key pillars that Lou mentioned that we're testing is how we are, informing and having a more productive conversation around the trade-offs inherent in development. So again, by visualizing some of this stuff, by gamifying it, and by looking at actually what are the quid pro quos here, we hope, and we have tested and proven this through some projects, that you can change perhaps what sometimes is a more negative conversation. So again, we want to keep testing this through our fund and sharing more of these outcomes with industry over the months to come.
Lovely, thank you. I've got a question here for Jack. Jack, is there any suggested way of learning 3D visualization for those who have basic GIS skills, or any training you recommend?
So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I've seen someone comment in the chat who we've actually been working with on exactly this, like helping a local authority unlock capability they didn't realize they had. So working with a geospatial team who's traditionally 2D based, didn't realize that they could also move that over to 3D. So sort of pointing them in the right direction. I mean, there's an abundance of training resources online. It also largely depends on the system that your organization is using. And it might be worth touching base with your geospatial teams in your respective organizations to determine what capability they already have on offer, and if they are lacking, certainly happy to give some pointers where necessary. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
That's excellent, thank you. And then another quick question for you, Jack. In terms of different prop tech companies, do we have a preferred supplier list, or how should somebody go about choosing a company?
We wish we had a preferred supplier list. We're working toward it. I mean, I think, again, I've commented, responded to someone else's comment in the chat. It's another area of work at the moment. We're looking into our strategic approach to that sector. I mean, Bridget and the team, DLUHC, have done a fantastic job of really getting hands-on and encouraging the use of these services. So we've sort of been piggybacking off of that in a way, understanding more of these services on offer, and championing them to the rest of the organisation. Some are already being used, some are new to the market, and we're building up a better understanding so we can communicate it more consistently across the organization instead of siloed approaches. And importantly, we are working on a sort of a multidisciplinary framework panel refresh at the moment, which will see us encouraging the use of these approaches, specifically the 3D mapping approaches, from the consultants that will be using on these services. So we hope to see either the consultants themselves using it, or fielding that work out and leaning more on some of the prop tech firms that we've touched on here, or others that aren't aware of, just to make the use of this sector just grow exponentially. So yeah,
yeah, we are indeed, Jack, and I was part of the judging team for that master planning panel. And once we've got it set up, local authorities are and other partners, are able to piggyback off our panel if they would like to.
That's right.
So watch this space. That will be quite imminent. Chris, question for you. A kind of general question really about community engagement. How do we ensure that blind and partially sighted individuals aren't left out of any of the tech proposals?
Well, excuse me. First of all, it's really important that when we consider targeting engagement on a certain project, that we understand the groups that we're going to look to include, and then how. So the way that we would advocate to consultants that would do these things on our projects on our behalf is to come up with a suggested methodology and then go and test it before they go and actually do it. Is to go and test it with relevant groups and say, would this work? This is what we would like the outcome to be, and this is what we're looking to achieve it. How would that work in practice? And can you let us know what would make it better for you as a recipient of that? So what you're doing is you're doing a little bit of sort of co-design before you're actually starting to do the consultation. I mean, really, if we're really pushing the boat out, co-commissioning. So it's peer-to-peer engagement. That's the thing that is the most effective way to do it, to do any form of community engagement in our experience. Peer-to-peer engagement in targeted way, get through to local groups and local parts of the local community that is specifically relevant in a certain setting.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. Victoria, I've got a question for you. I know you did comment earlier about funding, but we've had a number of people asking about how much it's going to cost and how much budget should they set aside and so on. With your experience on different projects that have been happening to date, I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I was trying to reply in the chat, but this might be easier. So relatively, it's fairly cheap. So to do a whole high street can cost you anything between £15,000 and £20,000. Now, when you start to consider what development you're going to do in that place in terms of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds, it's a small percentage of the price. And when you start to consider that if you go to B&Q and you want a new kitchen, they will do that in 3D for you. They'll put it on your phone for you, and you can show everybody what kitchen you've got on your phone, and you're spending £15,000. So the technology is out there. It's not special. It's out there. It's a question of asking for it. And architects all work digitally. They have been for years. They just don't show planners their 3D models, because the process is give us some 2D maps and we'll upload it. So they don't give it to you. And the main reason they don't give it to you is because you don't ask for it. If you ask for it or insist upon it, then they'll give it to you. So there are a couple of LAs, particularly in London, that are requesting it. So at pre-app, they're saying, please, can we have your 3D model? Could you show us? So I think I said in the chat that LAs can commission, their high street for around about the 20,000 mark. And then to maintain it and run it, the platform owner, which you will license, will be able to take the pain of dropping in the architect's drawing into the model, you logging on Teams with your code and seeing it. It is fairly simple. The bit that you have to do is your back office procurement of your 3D model, making sure that you own the data, making sure that it is open public source, which is we're going to come on to a bit. And then making sure that the licensing is fit for purpose. And a lot of that detail around licensing and fees and platforms is something that we're working on at the moment to make sure that there's quality out there that people can rely on. and that it's really, really managed well behind the scenes for LAs. And I know that Bridget and Lou have got quite a number of projects up and running that have been working on that. And we want to use best practice really and share that. So I know that we're going to have some of that shared learning come out, which will be really important for people, because I can see from the comments that the fear factor is, oh, it's digital. How do we now learn a new process? And actually, I think that's the bit we need to take away from planners. You've got enough work to do. What we need to do is a really simple tool that actually you make the market use, you make the market deliver it by saying this is what you want and make them do it.
Thank you, Victoria. And can I just pick up on one of the points you made there? Links into another question somebody's asked. They've asked about the data itself. I mean, I know you said it, you know, who should own the data and so on, but they've asked, could the data actually be used by the community after planning and construction? And also, could it be handed over to local community groups or housing providers to continue with the engagement?
Absolutely. So our thesis on this is that it should be open public source data that people can use, that people can access. So yes, I think that, you know, once you've done that capital investment and community groups want to use it. So if a community group, for instance, employs an architect to do a community building, they should just have free access to the platform. The architect should be able to download it. And you should be able to see it. Absolutely. And it is that straightforward. The actual maintaining of the platform is the key to it. And that's the key through licensing. And therefore, I would see that the LA would have control of that. And you might set a small fee for downloading so that somebody else manages that for you. And then that's quite straightforward to say, yes, you can have open public access. If you want to download something, there's a small fee. And then that's pretty straightforward. Can I also just answer another question that previously about?
Can I just bring in Bridget? She's got something to comment on this one. Then I'll come back to you, Victoria. Bridget,
it's fine. I was only to build on your, I think, very valid point, Victoria, around like, you know, there's two things. The open data standards, completely agree. That's part of the work that we're doing in the Levelling Up bill on the digital powers that our digital team is literally creating and working policy on. So, you know, we will move to that system, and we want to use the time now, between now and then, to work with industry, including those on the call here today, to test what that looks like at a really practical sense. So how we balance that strategic view, looking across the entire country, recognizing, picking up on the chat here, that there are some fundamental structural issues right now with planning. We can't solve them all between us and the call. I'm sure we'd love to, but our space is, you know, using digital tools to do some of that when it comes to having a more open data standards and framework, so people can work in the open. And as Victoria was saying, communities and architects and others can test and work with the assets that we're creating and investing in here. And also, to the other point around I think just working much closer with industry, and I mentioned that at the start of our presentation, what we have going for us in the UK is a world-leading tech sector. And it's fair to say that other countries don't have that yet, but they will as that sector grows. And right now, we have a unique opportunity where that sector wants to work in local government. They want to work in the planning and housing sector. It's up to everyone on this call and across industry to work together in that space and figure out what some of these practical points look like, because we've got an industry that wants to develop and innovate alongside us. And I think that really is our unique advantage to solve some of these issues as we go forward. But Victoria, sorry, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, back to you, Victoria. Thank you, Bridget.
Yeah, it was just a quick one, going back to that diversity and how this digital visualization would work with the blind people. Well, how does it traditionally work with blind people when you've got a 2D drawing on a website, or you go to a town hall and you've got a 2D drawing? And in fact, traditionally, if you go and make a model, or you ask an architect to make a model with the paper and the cardboard, it will cost you a fortune. Whereas with digital, you just send your digital 3D model to a laser printer and they can print you out a 3D model. So if you have a particular user group that needs that, actually this is quick, this is fast, this is cheap, and therefore I think it's more inclusive.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As to how, what should we say, how user-friendly a 3D model is necessarily to, unless there are particular features in the local environment. I mean, that's one kind of reason why we should have design, and we should have kind of gateways and nodes and, you know, local features so that people can actually work out where they are in their environment. So it's a good reason really to promote good quality design as well.
It's
I've
as
got a
many
question.
tools as possible for the different diverse audience that we need to talk to.
Absolutely. I've got a question for you, Louise, if you don't mind. How do DLUHC see the use of informal engagement tools and digitisation and so on in terms of other parts of planning, the planning system, such as local plan engagement?
Sorry, my mute button was being very sticky. Local plans are a huge part of it. I think we have a local plans team internally who we're working with very closely. And to be honest, at least 50% of the pilots we've been working on have been piloting on local plans. And I think it's a huge process that we have to acknowledge, you know, currently takes such a huge kind of resource and cost investment, and there are so many other stakeholders that play a part in that as well. So I think these engagement tools are not only going to support local authorities in cutting down the time it takes to process representations, which is, as we know, is kind of one of the biggest time sinks, but also encouraging people like stat consultees who we're working with to engage more digitally rather than via letter or email, which then takes more time for local authorities to process. And then at the back end of the process, working with PINs to think about their user needs and how digital can become a bigger part of that, and how that all fits with policy and the regs. So we know, I think people have alluded to in the chat that, you know, we're trying to move to a 30-month process, and digitizing the engagement process is such a crucial part of moving to that timeline. It's a huge jump to get to 30 months, and no one underestimates that challenge. But we think digital is a huge part of that, which is why we're working so closely internally with our local plans colleagues to make sure that digital engagement is part of the solution, and is kind of included in the regs, which will be obviously being updated. So yeah, local plans is a huge part of it, and we're using all of the insight we're getting from these pilots with local authorities to feed that right back into policy, because that's essentially one of the big barriers right now. We acknowledge that. So yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a subsequent question, which is a little cheeky of me, really, Louise, because it's not your specialist subject. It's probably one we should be asking Joanna Overley rather than yourself. But you mentioned PINs. Somebody said that a lot of the hearings that they've kind of been to in relation to local plans have focused more on the inspectorate taking notice of objections. And how can you see that kind of levels of support could be taken notice of, not just objections?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the part of that is the fact that we're mainly only hear currently from the people who are objecting, and you know, there's not enough opportunity for people that are in support, and they're not incentivized enough to contribute. So I think part of what we're trying to work on with PINs is that summarization piece. Like, often local authorities obviously have the job of summarizing everything they've heard for a local plan inspector and send that to them. And often, you know, what comes out of that is these are all the main issues, rather than these are all the things that people wanted to see, or these are all the things that were supported. So people have nodded to tech that can help do that, whether it's natural language processing or AI, whatever it is. But there's lots of ways in which we want to work with PINs to make sure that the positivity of people's comments come out. And I think the new process is also thinking about the stages of engagement. So whether, you know, Reg 18 and Reg 19, and what the real purpose of those is in terms of getting the right responses at the right time. So needless to say, we have kind of inspectors working with us closely to figure out how we can change the conversation, and yeah, to get to a point where we're hearing the positive voices as well as the objections, which are still equally valid.
So I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for coming along. Here's the contact information. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you most of all to all the speakers. It's an excellent session.